Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace.
Welcome to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith. And Colin, it's not hard to imagine that you might be a Beatles fan.
I love that song, Imagine, or at least I love the music of it. I've got some problems with the words, of course. But, you know, it captures the imagination of people. A world of peace, imagine that. So why don't we have that? And the answer is that there's a problem around us. We live in a fallen world, and there's a problem within us. That this seed of what the Bible calls sin, this rebellion against God, this inability to live the life even that we desire to live, that resides within us and can only be dealt with by Jesus Christ. So I talk in the message today about John Lennon, about his son's testimony with regards to his experience of his father. Why is it that this vision of a world of peace always eludes us? Well, we're going to look at that today.
Well, grab your Bible if you can and join us in Micah Chapter 4 as we begin the message, The God Who Gathers His Own Community. Here's Colin.
Well, last week I had the opportunity of traveling to speak at a conference for pastors in California. And I find this recurring experience that whenever I walk through an airport, I am overcome by an overwhelming urge to buy a book, which is really rather strange because, as my wife regularly points out, I am usually carrying a case that is already bulging with books that are still to be read. But it happens nonetheless. And on this trip, browsing at the stand of new book releases in the airport, I found this one that's just out. It is a new biography of John Lennon of Beatles fame by his first wife, Cynthia, complete with a foreword by their son, Julian. Now, I'm about halfway through this book, which is a fascinating account of a creative genius with big dreams and great struggles, written by a woman who really never stopped loving him. Now, one of John Lennon's best-known songs is called Imagine. Many will know it well. It paints a picture of life as John and so many others would want it to be. Let me read the words to you. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one. Now that is a powerful dream. And that song is loved around the world, not only because it has a great tune, but also because it strikes a chord in the hearts of millions of people. Imagine. Imagine no greed. Imagine no killing. Imagine no hunger. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. It's a big dream. Now, it seems from the words of the song that Lennon thought that that dream would best be achieved if there was no hope of heaven and no fear of hell. It would be best achieved, he thought, without religion and therefore, presumably, without God. In other words, the dream was a dream that was based on a perception of a fundamental goodness in the human heart, which, if only it could be tapped and released, would bring us into a new and better world. Imagine. Now, a few months back, PBS broadcast a recording that Karen and I watched with great pleasure of the Queen Elizabeth's, I mustn't say the Queen's, I'm sorry, Queen Elizabeth's Jubilee concert. Queen Elizabeth II has been on the throne in England for over 50 years, and so to celebrate her Jubilee on the throne, she opened up the grounds of Buckingham Palace for a series of open-air concerts. Now, the last of these concerts was a pop concert with a galaxy of stars from the last 50 years. And the whole event, to a packed audience, as you can imagine, ended with Paul McCartney and Elton John and a host of others leading this vast crowd in the open-air grounds of Buckingham Palace, and they were singing the old Beatles song, All You Need Is Love. You remember that one? Now, I found myself thinking, when I saw that, what a great tragedy it was that John Lennon wasn't there. Because, of course, he wrote that song with Paul McCartney. All you need is love. And perhaps he would have been there if it had not been for the deluded fan who gunned him down on the streets of New York. All you need is love. The problem is that we live in a world of violence. Well, getting on the plane and settling down into this book, I found myself gripped by the first paragraph that I want to read to you. This is from the foreword that is written by John Lennon's son, Julian. Listen to this. Growing up as John Lennon's son has been a rocky path. All my life, I've had people coming up to me and saying, I loved your dad. I always have very mixed feelings when I hear this. I know that Dad was an idol to millions who grew up loving his music and his ideals. But to me, he wasn't a musician or a peace icon. He was the father I loved and who let me down in so many ways. After the age of 5, when my parents separated, I saw him only a handful of times. And when I did, he was often remote and intimidating. I grew up longing for more contact with him, but felt rejected and unimportant in his life. Dad was a great talent, a remarkable man who stood for peace and love in the world. But at the same time, he found it very hard to show any peace and love to his first family, my mother and me. Imagine. There are two problems with the dream set out in Imagine. There's the problem around us. Imagine all the people living life in peace. But what are you going to do about the deluded gunman in New York? And then there's not only the problem around us, there's the problem within us. Imagine all the people living life in peace. But how can a man or a woman hope to bring peace and love to the world if he cannot bring peace and love to his own family, his own son? See, if the dream of true community, the end of war, the end of hunger and peace on earth is to be realized, then there has to be a solution to the problem around us and the problem within us. And that's why I want you to turn to Micah Chapter 4 with me today. Because what you'll find here is a description of peace and love that has some things in common with Lennon's Imagine, that strikes a chord within the human heart. But the way in which it comes about is profoundly different from what is set out in the song.
We have to pause the message briefly just there, and you're listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith, and a message today called The God Who Gathers His Own Community. It's part of our series called Close Encounters with the Living God. And if you've missed any of the series, or if you want to go back and listen again, you can do that by coming online to our website, openthebible.org.uk. Open the Bible is supported entirely by our listeners, and this month, if that's something you've been considering doing, we have an offer for you. If you can set up a new donation to the work of Open the Bible in the amount of £5 per month or more during this month, we'd love to thank you by sending you a copy of a book by Kevin DeYoung. It's called Impossible Christianity. Subtitled, Why Following Jesus Does Not Mean You Have to Change the World, Be an Expert in Everything, Accept Spiritual Failure, and feel miserable pretty much all of the time. More details later. Back to the message now. We're in Micah 4. Here's Colin.
Micah speaks, do you see that in verse 3, about a day when they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, where nation will not take up sword against nation, and nor will they train for war anymore. Now, look at what Micah's describing. He is describing total disarmament. Something that has never, ever been seen in the history of the world. We've had periods of some disarmament. There has never in the history of the world been a total disarmament, but that is what Micah is describing here. In our terms today, and he's speaking of the last days, and therefore we should think of it in this way. Nuclear missiles decommissioned. Chemical weapons eliminated. Surface-to-air missiles exploded by being sent up into the sky without targets in the all-time world's greatest fireworks display. Al-Qaeda camps closed. Guantanamo Bay emptied. The US military honored, thanked, decommissioned, and deployed in civilian affairs. Defense budgets reallocated to seed planting for economic growth and development. Imagine. Now, of course, we find it almost impossible to imagine because the only world you and I have ever known is one in which there is hostility and fear and the threat of attack, and you switch on the news to see what color the threat level is today. We cannot imagine a world in which there is no need for defense. Can't imagine. But Micah speaks of a day when there will be such peace on earth, not just peace that comes from the absence of war, but peace that comes from the absence even of the threat of war and of hostility, and therefore military budgets and weapon systems will be a fading memory from the past. Imagine. Quite a dream. Along with this peace, in verse 4, he makes it clear that there will also be security. Look at it. Every man will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. Now, this is so different, of course, from the experience of Micah's hearers that it would have been very hard for them to imagine. We saw from chapter 3, if you were there here last week, you may remember that the powerful land barons were seizing land from the poor, driving them off their own land. But here, there is security from that kind of violence. Here, every person is on his own land, his own property, his boundaries are secure. Everyone sits under his own fig tree, and no one makes them afraid. No one makes them afraid. I mean, can you imagine that? Can you imagine being able to walk any street in Chicago at any time of day or night without fear, without ever looking over your shoulder or feeling in your pocket to make sure your wallet's still there? No one will make them afraid. Can you imagine doing business without any threat of lawsuits? No one will make them afraid. Can you imagine going through airports without detectors because there are no threats? Can you imagine turning on the television news in the full confidence that there will not be a story of rape or violence or no reports of any terror attack? No one will make them afraid. Not even Satan himself will be able to intimidate God's people because he's included with no one. They will be beyond the reach even of temptation. Imagine Every man will sit under his own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. Peace and security. That's quite a dream. Now, obviously, these are very beautiful words and wonderful thoughts, and they are light years away from the reality of the world in which we live. So the question is Micah also a dreamer? Is Micah going to write at the end of chapter 4, "You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one"? Is that what he's saying? No. Look at the end of verse 4, will you? Here's his basis for what he writes. "For the mouth of the Lord Almighty has spoken." See what he's saying? You need to know that as I write these things that are almost beyond what you can imagine, I'm not dreaming. What I, Micah, am describing here is not some vague hope for a better world. It's not a dream, it's a promise. And it is the promise of Almighty God. Yahweh has spoken. The mouth of the Lord has spoken this. God has said. One day nation will not take up sword against nation. They will beat their swords into plowshares. Every man will sit under his own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. That's the promise of God. Now, this obviously raises two questions. The first is, how in all the world will this ever happen? And the second question is, when might we expect to see this happen? And so that's where I want to focus for the rest of our time. How and when? How and when? First of all, how? Look at verse 1. The mountain of the Lord's temple will be established. Now, whenever you read in the Old Testament about the temple, you need to realize that in the Old Testament, the temple was the place of God's presence. This was the place where he said his presence would come down in a particular way on the earth. Remember, God said in Exodus 25 that he would meet his people at the Ark of the Covenant, and the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the temple. So that when Solomon's temple was built, the presence of God came down, and the cloud of the glory of his presence filled the temple. So when we read about the temple in the Old Testament, we're talking about the place to which God has said he would come. And Micah clearly foresees a day when God would visibly come to his temple. Verse 2, many nations will come and say, "Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways." Who's the he? Obviously God himself. This is the Lord himself having come in a visible form to his temple. And if God is to come on earth to a physical place in a way that is seen and known, he must obviously come in some visible form. And so Micah is clearly anticipating a day when the Messiah, the Christ, will come to the temple in Jerusalem. This will be a day when God will draw near. His presence and his word will be made known on the earth. Now, this sounds marvelous, but of course it does not answer the question of how there will be peace and security. We still have the question, well, okay, the presence of God comes, but how will he deal with the deluded gunman, the rapist, the terrorist organization, and how will he deal with the broken heart, the abandoned mother, the forlorn son, and so forth? Now, Micah answers these questions about what will happen when the presence of the Lord comes with four simple statements that I want us to get hold of. These are the statements that bring us from dreams to reality and from vague hopes to solid promises. Number one, God will judge. You find this both in verse 3 and in verses 11 and 12. Let's look at both. Verse 3, he will judge between many peoples. Now, this is telling us that God will resolve disputes among his own people. So many disputes, even among God's people, never get resolved. But here, Christ will resolve them. That's what God will do for his people. It's a wonderful thing. And Micah also tells us not only that he'll bring the reconciliation of disputes among his people, but he will also bring judgment towards his enemies. Look at verse 11. But now many nations are gathered against you. That's against Israel. They say, verse 11, let her be defiled, and their eyes gloat over Zion. Verse 12, they do not know the thoughts of the Lord. They do not understand his plan. He who gathers them like sheaves to the threshing floor. So what this is saying is that when the presence of God comes, he will not only bring reconciliation to his people, but he will bring judgment to his enemies. Second, he will gather. He will judge, but he will gather. Verse 6, I will gather the lame. I will assemble the exiles. See, here's the beauty. Those who come under the ultimate judgment of God are those who continue to the end to shake their fist at him. But for all who will come, his arms are outstretched, and he says, I will gather. Third, he rules. He rules. God will rule. Verse 7, the Lord will rule over them in Mount Zion. Now here's something wonderful. When you become one of Christ's flock, you submit your life to his rule. That's what it means to come to him. When he says, come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest, he immediately goes on to say what? Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. Those he gathers, he also rules. And then verse 10, God will redeem. God will redeem. Verse 10. You will go to Babylon. There you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you out of the hand of your enemies. So now here's the how. Here is how God fulfills his promise. Micah says he'll judge, he'll gather, he'll rule, and he'll redeem.
What a wonderful promise that is. We don't know when, but someday God is going to bring about peace and prosperity to this world. You're listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith, and a message today called The God Who Gathers His Own Community. If you tuned in late, or if you ever miss one of our broadcasts, you can always catch up online. Go back and listen again. That's at openthebible.org.uk. Or you can find us as a podcast, and those are available on all the major podcasting sites by searching for Open the Bible UK or by following the link on our website. Also available on our website and available as a podcast is Open the Bible Daily, and that's a series of short 2 to 3 minute daily reflections based on Pastor Colin's teaching and read in the UK by Sue McLeish. There is a fresh one every day, and so it's a great way to start the day. Open the Bible is supported entirely by our listeners. That's people just like you. And if that's something you're considering doing, this month we have an offer for you. If you're able to set up a new donation to the work of Open the Bible in the amount of £5 per month or more, we'd love to thank you by sending you a copy of Kevin DeYoung's book, Impossible Christianity. Colin, what would you hope that someone reading this book will take away from it?
Well, Kevin DeYoung does a brilliant job of distinguishing between the life that God calls us to lead and the sometimes impossible burdens that we place on ourselves. And that's why it's such a helpful and such a liberating book. For example, when he talks about prayer, he talks about the importance of prayer. And anyone who really walks with the Lord knows that. We often feel that we need to pray more. We can live under a burden of saying, have I ever prayed enough? And have I ever prayed as sincerely and deeply as I ought? And we end up putting burdens on ourselves that can easily make following Christ feel like a joyless experience. And so I've found Impossible Christianity to be really helpful in just restoring a sense of perspective, a sense of peace to the soul, and it's right out of the scriptures. It's faithful to what God says, but it brings to us a sense of a life that is made possible by the grace of God as we follow hard after the Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, we'd love to send you a copy of Kevin DeYoung's book to say thank you for setting up a new donation to the work of Open the Bible in the amount of £5 per month or more. Full details of this offer are on our website, openthebible.org.uk. For Open the Bible and Pastor Colin Smith, I'm David Pick, and I hope you'll be able to join us again next time. With all the problems in the world, where can we find peace and security? Find out next time on Open the Bible.